Okay.
Hi, welcome to the Jewish Orthodox Women's Medical Association, or JOMA, podcast. I'm your host, Elisa Minkin. I'm a general pediatrician, and I'm also the co-chair of the Preventative Health Committee. And I'm really honored and really excited to be here with Dr. David Gorski. Thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Dr. Gorski is surgical oncologist at the Barbara Ann Karmanos Cancer Institute, specializing in breast cancer surgery, and a professor of surgery at the Wayne State University School of Medicine. He attended the University of Michigan, where he received a medical degree in 1988, same year as me. In 1989, he entered a residency in general surgery at the University Hospitals of Cleveland, took a break to get a Ph.D. in cellular physiology at the Case Western Reserve University, which he completed in 1994, went back to his surgical residency, which he completed in 1996, and completed a surgical oncology research fellowship, which in 1999 at the University of Chicago. He is the author of a blog called Respectful Insolence and the managing editor of the website Science-Based Medicine, which are both science skeptic sites, which we'll get to. He has been writing about vaccine misinformation and other pseudoscience topics since 2004. And prior to that, he fought Holocaust denialism. So I just want to take a second. It's a really challenging time for the Jewish people right now. We're having a lot of anti-Semitic flares. It's really scary. And so you're not Jewish, correct?
No, I'm not.
Right. So I just want to thank you for your work on Holocaust, fighting Holocaust denialism. And I'd love to hear, just even though that has nothing to do with what we're, well, not too much to do, right?
It's sort of, if you really go way back, but go ahead.
I do want to hear a little bit of how you got into that, because I'm sure our listeners will be interested. So again, thank you so much for joining me.
It was actually kind of my gateway into skepticism, as I like to say. Basically, sometime around 1997 or 98, I forget which. I was perusing Usenet. I don't know if anyone remembers Usenet.
Not me.
Really? And you're roughly my age and you don't remember it?
Because I'm a Luddite.
Well, think of Usenet as social media before there was Facebook or any of those other things. It's basically a worldwide network of discussion forums, all text-based. It's like just pure text.
Proto-internet.
It's like, do you remember BBSs? You didn't remember bulletin board systems?
Vaguely, very vaguely.
It was like a giant worldwide bulletin board system, and it still exists as far as I know. I just don't think anyone uses it anymore. But somehow I don't remember how. It's like, this is one of those things that's like lost in the mists of time, or given that it's well over 20 years ago. One day, I don't remember how, I found a Usenet news group called Alt Revisionism, and you just, the naming convention is like a prefix followed by a dot followed by a word describing what the Usenet news group was about. Well, revisionism. Revisionism. Is what Holocaust deniers like to call their Holocaust denial. They like to call it Holocaust revisionism. And I came across a post by a denier who went by the name of Polakowski, just Polakowski, no first name, claiming that they practiced ethical medicine at Auschwitz. And we don't need to go into the details. I got into it there, and there was all sorts of weird misinformation about how they were treated actually just fine, and like like when they started to show signs of protein malnutrition, they would be fed milk, and it just goes on, or it went on and on. And somehow that is refuting that sort of misinformation sucked me into like the whole area of Holocaust denial, which, going beyond the medical, then you start getting into the conspiracy theory that that really there were not roughly 6 million Jews murdered, and that there were no gas chambers, or that the gas chambers that were there were never used for murder. They were used to, you've probably heard some of these,
right.
that they were used for delousing clothing, that sort of thing. And then within a couple, that was my main interest for a couple of years, and then I started encountering quackery in the anti-vaccine movement and sort of branched out from there.
Right. What is a science skeptic, by the way? Because I use that term to just kind of describe your site and the site. There's a
That's
number
a
of
hard,
sites.
that's a hard one to. That's actually harder to define than you might think. I mean, because for instance, a whole lot of science deniers call themselves skeptics. It's one of my pet peeves. Climate science deniers call themselves climate skeptics. Vaccine anti-vaxxers like to call themselves vaccine skeptics. It's a word that's misused a lot, and admittedly, the line between skepticism and denial isn't always a bright one. But I think skepticism involves really trying to look at the evidence in as unbiased a fashion as possible when you're examining claims, and leaving your mind open to the possibility that claims being made might be wrong. Insisting on insisting on good evidence, not cherry picking the evidence, which is part of what differentiates skeptics from deniers.
Right. What does cherry picking mean?
Picking only the evidence that supports your position. And ignoring or downplaying the rest.
Right. The reason you say that anti-vaxxers call themselves skeptics, but they're not, is because they have a belief, and that is a fixed belief.
I like to say this. The old saying about the drunk and the light post.
Yep.
Right.
They drew the circle around.
They're like drunks looking for their keys. Near a light post. They use the light instead of using the light post for illumination. They use it for support. So they don't fall down.
Right. But to be fair, there are plenty of people who are truly skeptical. They really want to know the truth. And that's not the same thing. They'll be open. I think the difference is they'll be open to different interpretations, and someone who has a fixed belief will not.
Well, there's another, one thing I like to say, for instance, I like to say, for instance, that hardcore anti-vaxxers, you will not change their mind.
Right.
Period. It's possible, but it's so difficult and requires so much effort and has such a low probability of success as to be basically not worth your time. Because you're not going to change their mind. That's at the far end. Those are like those are deniers who and even they may call themselves skeptics as much as they like, but they're not. They're deniers.
Right. They're the world's best motivated reasoners.
Well, humans are very, very good at motivated reasoning.
We all are, but they're better.
And the problem is the more intelligent and higher level of education you've attained, often the better you are at motivated reasoning.
Right. By the way, I've interviewed Dr. Jonathan Howard.
Right.
I learned about his book from Science-Based Medicine.
It's good.
Book on critical medical thinking. And then my first podcast was critical thinking for lay people, how not to fool yourself as much.
Right. Well, yeah. Even the skepticiest of skeptics, as I like to say, could still have themselves be fooled. It's been kind of depressing to see that happening during the pandemic.
Oh my gosh. I know exactly what you're talking about. It's awful. And that's what's happening right now is we have so much polarization, right? With many motivated reasoners picking their side and sticking to it. We've got a lot of politicization of a medical, virus, which is so frustrating. And, we have the classic fear, uncertainty, and doubt, which I call like the fertilization that the anti-vaxxers use to build their case on.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's so fear, uncertainty, and doubt, or the FUD, as we like to call it. And that's exactly what denial does. The idea is whatever the science or history, for that matter, or any other conclusion of an evidence-based discipline that they don't like, is the idea is to sow at least uncertainty and doubt about it, and then sometimes fear. It's like with vaccines, definitely fear.
Definitely fear. Definitely fear.
Cancer quackery. Cancer quackery is the same thing. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt about conventional cancer treatments.
Right, right. So we do have people who are literally skeptical. They don't trust what's coming out of the CDC, et cetera. And putting aside, besides that, there's been really terrible messaging, right? I mean,
Well, yeah, I mean, I like to see, it's hard not to get into politics some, but I like to say, or as I said, a year plus ago, we had the absolute worst luck to have arguably the worst possible administration to be in charge when something like COVID-19 hits. It's
I am completely staying out of politics
no,
because
I
I
know.
don't want people to
But
say,
even for
"Hey,
even even from an objective, even a lot of conservatives have to admit that.
right."
It's just.
And that's your bias, and it's okay that we have biases and we admit what our biases are.
But I mean, and it's just. But it's hard not. It was hard for me not to. Yeah, to let
Right.
that happen a little bit when you see the president, pushing unproven treatments,
We're getting, yeah,
denying the severity of the pandemic, et
we're
cetera, et
going to
cetera.
definitely get to those unproven treatments in just a minute. So, how is someone supposed to know what or who to believe? It's a mess, and we haven't even gotten to the fact that they use the same science techniques, and they have all their experts that have the same,
Right.
kind of degrees we have. Why should anybody believe us over them?
Well, that is the problem, isn't it? Um, Human beings, are not rational by and large. It takes work to be rational. I mean, we are rational, but we do let our biases and emotions tend to overrule the rationality, at least if the bias is strong enough. Um, so, I mean, how to get someone to listen to us? That's one that I don't know that anyone has
Right.
a
I mean,
good answer to
that
that.
wasn't even the question. The question was, how are people supposed to know what's good information and what's not? And I think that it might
Well, okay, I'll give you one right now, and
be.
this goes back to something I wrote about back in January. Conspiracy theories. Okay, if
Mhm.
you have to base the reasons for something that you're claiming on a conspiracy theory, that's a huge red flag. So if
Mhm.
someone's saying, for instance, this is a cure that they don't want you to know about,
Right.
or they are covering up all these supposed harms of vaccines, or in the case of Holocaust denial, it's a Jewish conspiracy, to make, Germany look bad, it's
It should warn you
that's
if
definitely
you
one
can't
red
trust
flag, and
anyone.
pretty much all science denial has a conspiracy theory at its basis. I've yet to be able to find a real exception. Some are more rooted in it than others,
Mhm.
obviously, especially the anti-vaccine movement and especially the COVID, denial movement. The anti-maskers and the anti-lockdown people. And there's definitely a huge element of conspiracy theories in all of those.
But the problem is that I find that they're very, very good at getting the message out the right way to the right people. They can completely eliminate what sounds like a conspiracy theory and just throw a lot of data at you. And so I want to go into a minute
Well,
of,
that's actually another thing.
yeah,
That's the infamous Gish Gallop, as you may
yes,
recall.
yes.
I guess the more formal name for it these days is fire hosing. If you can't dazzle them with brilliance, baffle them with.
Baloney.
But I mean, that's all it is. That's all it is. It's a sophisticated version of that. And the idea is um, that if you lay out enough stuff that some of which might be fine, some of it, most of which could be dubious, a lot of it could be obscure. That that people don't would actually have to look up. You basically make it impossible to refute, because refuting each piece of information would take like a lot longer than saying it. And then when you add it all up, it basically becomes unrefutable, or irrefutable. I mean, there is a a law. I don't know if you've ever heard of Brandolini's
Yep.
law.
Yep. The asymmetry.
And again, I can't use
Don't say it.
all right, the Bologna asymmetry principle, it's also known as it basically states that it takes it an order of magnitude more effort to refute the Bologna than it does to produce it.
Right. And I think
and
that,
I actually think that's a vast underestimate. It's
yes,
probably more like 2 or 3 orders of magnitude more.
Right. I think the difference between Gish Gallop and fire hosing, I'm going to make a distinction, even though it may be not real, is that now we have the internet and we have all this pseudoscience and all these scientific studies. They might not even be pseudoscience, but may be misused. And if you look at the comment section, right, even if your blog.
Yes, I know. You know, a confession right here. I do not really moderate the comments section of Science-Based Medicine. We have someone else who does that. In fact, I usually don't really hang out in the comment section much at all because it's just basically my time's better spent producing content than, you
Right.
know. I mean, I sometimes venture in, but yes, I know that there's a meme out there that I like to throw up every now and then. It's basically from the old Star Trek. You know, it's Captain Kirk.
Oh yeah.
It's like the episode where, you know, if I recall right, it's from the episode where he was split into 2. You know, like, and one was the evil Kirk and one was the good Kirk.
Oh yeah.
And he basically smacks a monitor. You know, like throws it aside. And basically, and after that, someone put underneath it the caption, "I read the comments." That's what comment sections feel like.
Right, but the point that that's hilarious. The point that I'm making is that now that we have all this stuff on the internet, they'll throw out 3 trillion links. You can't.
Yes. Well, no, that is
do anything.
That's fire hosing. I mean, you can call it the Gish Gallop. You can call it fire hosing. You can.
Any other name.
It's pretty. You know, it's basically a similar principle.
Right. So what they often say is, "I'm ready. I'm ready to debate. Give me the top expert. Why can't we just settle this once?"
My favorite. Yeah. Well, that's the other thing. And actually, wanting a live public debate is another thing that I've noticed about cranks, denialists, etc. They crave it, but why, you might ask? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One reason is just by standing on the same stage or in the same forum or on the same podcast or whatever with a real scientist or a real expert, it automatically elevates them. The second reason is debates of that sort don't really prize evidence as much as rhetoric. So they can easily appear to win, especially if the expert is not familiar with, like, the sorts of things that come up in a Gish Gallop. You know, like if you don't have it's really hard if you don't have a really intimate familiarity with the sorts of tropes, you know, and misdirections and misuse of evidence that they use. You can very easily get overwhelmed and appear to have your butt kicked, basically.
Right, because the problem is that most scientists and healthcare professionals don't know the whole field of misinformation. It's a separate field.
Well, no, and not everyone agrees with me on this, but I do not debate denialists, except unless they want to if they want to have a written debate, which they never do, because you know, you can spend time and they cannot fire hose in a written debate, at least not as easily, and rhetoric means a lot less in a written debate. But a live, you know, type spoken debate, whether in person or on a podcast or whatever, I just don't do. Now, not everyone agrees. Steve Novella has done it and had some success at it. I mean, I remember, God, it's almost 10 years ago now, when we were at the Amazing Meeting. There was, just down the road, there was a meeting called Freedom Fest.
Sounds
right, yeah, right-wing libertarian, that sort of thing. And they arranged a debate with Steve Novella, and I don't know. Are you familiar with Julian Whittaker?
Vaguely.
Dr. Whittaker? He's an alternative medicine practitioner and definitely anti-vaccine. And I was a bit dubious about this debate just because I'm like, oh, Steve's really good. Steve's like among the best there is as far as this sort of thing. But even so, I was a little nervous. It turned out that Whittaker was just so bad at this that like I could have beaten him. It was
Right.
like,
I mean, that's probably the exception.
But that you can't count on that.
Right. Right.
I
And
mean,
especially
he was pulling out these old anti-vax tropes that I could bat down without even thinking about it.
right, but
And
I think today they're even more sophisticated, even more, they've just got more ammunition, and
yeah, this was like 9 years ago, so it was
yeah,
like
yeah, it's very hard. Any other particular techniques that they use? Because I'm thinking of some from your blog. Prompting you.
like I mean, obviously there's cherry picking studies, misrepresenting studies, um, ad hominems, of course. Like if they try their hardest to tear down the source of an argument. I mean, hence the pharmaceuticals gambit. Like all of us apparently, every last one of us is in the pay of big pharma,
Right,
if
right.
you
I had a
believe
family.
them.
Yeah, I had a family with my practice, and on the way out, she says, "You just get so much money for these vaccines." I'm like, "I don't get a penny," but confident, completely
Yeah,
confident.
well, whenever they start bringing up, for instance, issues of like pay for performance or stuff like that, I have to defer to the primary care docs and pediatricians who actually do this stuff because I am
Okay.
not involved with any of
Nothing.
that stuff at all. Like, I don't. What I'm saying is I don't know how to refute that stuff because I don't know, one, if they're even telling the truth about these issues, or two, even if they are, what is the real story?
Right. We're not getting paid to give vaccines.
But there is pay for performance for various things if you're in like.
Don't get anything.
Well, no, I mean that's fine. I'm not
I
saying.
don't get bonuses based on vaccine rate. I don't get anything. I'm part of a large pediatric IPA, and no.
Sure. No, I know. I'm just saying it, but there is for instance, I know in Michigan, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan had some sort of pay for performance thing where certain percent vaccination rate. And they have the same thing for like among the adult practices for percent who get their colonoscopy, percent who get their
Right.
mammography, et cetera, et
Right.
cetera.
But this is to keep people healthy, to keep
Oh
the
no,
cost.
I'm not objecting. The problem they paint it as a nefarious thing when we view it
Right.
as a good thing.
Right. But that's just another technique. So why do people do this? What is the motivation?
Well, I like to break it down into two broad categories and there's considerable overlap between the two. True believers, like they actually believe this, whether they believe it because they believe something else, like that it resonates with something else. For instance, the anti-maskers and anti-lockdown people generally tend to lean on the libertarian conservative side of things. So like they just can't stand the government telling them what to do, even in the name of public health. So they're naturally prone, and that there's a large component of that to the anti-vaccine movement. Or whether you believe in natural is better, so you're drawn towards various quackery. Whatever the reason, true believers versus the entrepreneurs, or as I like to call them, the grifters.
So these are
But there's a lot of overlap. A lot of the true believers are also grifters. Like Joe Mercola, I think, started out as a true believer and then discovered the profit potential, and has made tons of made money hand over fist ever since for the last 20 years. My suspicion, and for instance with Mike Adams, is that he started out with the grift and found that it was very profitable in natural medicine because before he was into, before he started naturalnews.com a few years before. Do you know what he did? You know what his grift was?
I don't.
Y2K.
Y2K.
Remember the Y2K stuff?
Oh, we were looking at the clock turn.
No, like selling
that the whole world
remedies
was gonna
for
crash?
selling various solutions for I2K or Y2K, or selling like disaster prep for
Right. That
this disaster that was supposed to happen after the Y2K bug, knocked out every computer in the world.
right. So people don't know that when we turned the year 2000, there was a fear that our world was going to crash.
Well, I mean, you have to be above a certain age to remember
Right.
that. Like if you're under about your mid 30s, you probably don't remember that.
Yeah, no, I do remember it clearly because
Um,
your age.
the other thing he did before Natural News was he sold spam software, like software to send out spam.
Wow.
I don't know if he still does. I should look into that. But yeah, he made a lot of money at it.
Are there motivations besides, you mentioned financial and also attention, right? For a lot of people, it's reinforcing to be a leader in something.
You might have a point there with someone like Del Bigtree.
Mm-hmm.
Because before Vaxxed, that lovely anti-vaccine propaganda movie with Wakefield, he was an unknown producer. Nobody knew who he was. He was a producer on The Doctors. Like he produced segments for The Doctors. And then, as he tells it, somehow he came across, the various claims of the anti-vaxxers and found them compelling. And I don't know how he hooked up with Wakefield. But in any case, once he did that, once he produced that movie, he became a hero among the anti-vaccine movement. And, they just love him now.
Right.
And he found a way to make money on it too.
Right. So, there are people who make money. There are people who have fame. But it's important to know, like you said, that there are the true believers or the grassroots activists, because I think most people will come across one of those. It could be their aunt or their, other relatives or friends who really, really believes this.
And like I said, and I've, people, basically, as I said, it's pointless. It really is not worth your effort to try to deconvert a true believer. It's like hitting your head against the wall. It feels so good when it stops.
Mm-hmm.
You hurt, and you just hurt yourself doing it.
Right. But the problem is, yes, we're not going to put our efforts there. The problem is that they're influencing so
well. That's where what pre-bunking comes in.
Yes.
Instead of debunking, we
Yes.
call it the concept of pre-bunking. The idea is that you put the information out there that explains why this misinformation is misinformation, and you aim it at people who might be susceptible to the misinformation, but who are not true believers.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times it's people who just don't know any better because they don't have the background knowledge to know any better, which is, for like vaccines, it's like the vast majority of the population.
Right. I mean, especially now because we are in the middle of a pandemic, which completely put us in a blender, right? And we have a new vaccine that came out, quickly, which is to me a miracle, but other people it's scary that it was warp speed, right? And it's using a new technology which involves genetic-y sounding things.
Right. And it did not help that the last administration named its effort Operation Warp Speed. That was just like, I mean, they might have thought it was clever. What it was like a messaging disaster.
Right. We've had a lot of messaging disasters, right? I mean, and it's understandable that people will be afraid. I'm like, this is the moment of the anti-vaccine movement, right? This is their time to shine. So,
well, I will say one thing real quick though. Mm-hmm. So there were a lot of us, and to some extent me, although I was quickly disabused of this idea. There used to be an argument 10 or 20 years ago that, if we ever had a really bad epidemic of a really nasty disease, anti-vaxxers would come around and they'd be wanting the vaccine.
Nope.
Exactly. Nope, you're correct. but there used to be this naive idea,
Very
you
naive.
know, that would be true. You know, that like if they ever really saw what an infectious disease could do, you know, that like vaccines are victims of their own success. You know, nobody ever sees children dying of, you know, these diseases anymore because it's so rare now. But if people were to see this again, you know, they would change their minds.
Yeah, no, it's really mind-boggling because what they do, right, is they exaggerate the risks of the vaccine and they minimize the risks of the
But this
disease.
is obviously nothing new. This is what they did this pre-pandemic.
Right. And by the way, they were prepared. They probably disappointed that it came out as fast as it did because they had less time to prepare, but they had enough time to prepare. I had parents coming in my office crying that their children were going to get mandated to get a vaccine that did not yet exist.
Well, yeah, I mean, and here's the other thing, you know, not those of there is not. I've said this a number of times on the blog and on social media. There is nothing new under the sun with the
Right.
anti-vaccine movement. Every single bit of misinformation you see about COVID vaccines has been around a while. It's just been repurposed.
Recycled, right.
So, like the whole thing about taking reports from the VAERS database, you know, of adverse events after vaccination, and representing them as being caused by the vaccine when the VAERS database cannot prove causation. That's something that they've done as long as I can remember, as long as I paid attention to this. In fact, any study out of the VAERS data, you know, they used to do, anti-vaxxers used to do studies of the VAERS database, and we used to call it dumpster diving because, you know, VAERS is not designed for that. It can't give you a true prevalence of anything, you know, and it's gamed. You know, I wrote like 15 years ago, I was writing about how lawyers for parents suing vaccine manufacturers were encouraging parents to report autism as an adverse event to vaccination. You know, they were trying to game the database.
And then they put it in the
and
insert.
They still because... are, and they still are. There's evidence that they still are, you know, with COVID. But even so, you know, there's kind of an interesting contradiction there, because anti-vaxxers will paint VAERS as like the be-all and end-all of vaccine safety. You know, like it's the only system out there monitoring that, and it's not. You know, there are at least two others. You know, there's the Vaccine Safety Data Link, there's the PRISM system, and there's one more. You know, and those are not, unlike VAERS, which is what we call a passive reporting system. You know, it relies on people just spontaneously reporting anything to the database, which, you know, is prone to lots of biases and underreporting of some things, overreporting of others. There are active surveillance systems, you know, that just monitor like the electronic medical records of various systems, looking for, you know, diagnoses popping up and correlating with vaccination. And yeah, I mean, VAERS is what I like to call a hypothesis generating system. Like, it can't prove anything. If you see something pop up, it's either an early warning system or it generates a hypothesis that you test with the other systems.
And that's how we picked up that rare blood clot problem for the Johnson & Johnson.
Well, that's the other thing I like to say. You know, so here's another contradiction. You know, they claim, oh, they're releasing these vaccines with insufficient testing, and they're not really paying attention to all the horrors that they're causing, you know, according to them. And then, you know, the J&J vaccine, just for an example, after only about 6 weeks of its having been released, they detected a literally 1 in a million adverse reaction.
Right. It's amazing.
And they acted on it. I mean, it's a little more now because they found some more cases, but at the time it was like right around 1 in a million.
Right. I mean, we're trying to make an accurate risk-benefit decision, and they turn it on its head. They literally turn it on its head. So it's hard for me to fully understand how they say that we shouldn't be worried about COVID. I don't know if you've seen those numbers that came out that if you're this age, you have a 99.9999.
Well, yeah, I mean, for one thing, this is another classic this is another anti-vax technique that's not old, or that's not new.
Mhm.
Because they were doing this with the measles and other
Mhm.
diseases,
Mhm.
years and years ago. It's like, oh, the chance of death from measles is only 1 in 1,000. That's actually rather close to what they claim for, COVID. Um, but in any event, the it's an old technique to deny the severity of a disease. It ignores it ignores one thing, which is what I like to call the law of large numbers. So let's say the infection fatality rate really is only 0.2% or 1 in 500. When hundreds of millions of people get the disease, you end up with huge numbers of deaths and huge numbers of people overwhelming the hospital system,
Which we've seen. We've seen it
which
with
we
our
have seen more
eyes.
than once.
But they don't say that though. They say something else, right? They're saying what
What are
it's
you
not
getting at?
really COVID.
I'm sorry?
I said they're saying something else. That whole case-demic thing.
Oh yeah, well that's the other thing. Yeah, the other two, for instance, the claim, the case endemic is another way of saying that that it's overblown, which the old anti-vaccine claim that the disease is not as severe as claimed, or that they're over diagnosing or overestimating how much of it there is. That one goes way back.
But they're still saying it. They're saying they didn't really die from the disease. They died with the disease, or the
Right.
hospitals had an incentive to label them as COVID, or they got paid more for COVID cases.
Sure. Yeah, I mean that's and it'll probably go on. I'm sure it'll continue.
Right, but the whole point is that is the effort to minimize the disease, and then they say, well, what do you need a vaccine for? We have cures.
Well, that's that of course goes in. That again very similar. So we have if you have these miracle cures, you don't need a vaccine, right?
Right, but we don't.
No, that's correct. And the things that actually do work, like steroids, don't work they're not that hugely effective. Yes, they decrease mortality, but they're no miracle cure.
Right, and I think that they understand that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. The problem is they think the ounce of prevention is hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin. You're
Vitamin
laughing, but people take
D,
this very seriously. They really,
vitamin
really
D,
do.
zinc, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine. So I used to like to say that ivermectin is the new hydroxychloroquine, but I think there must be other things supplanting ivermectin now.
Because we don't have evidence that it works.
No, we don't have evidence that any of them work. But now here's the interesting thing. There is a real astroturf effort, and you know what an astroturf effort
Yeah, I'm going to have
is?
you explain it. I do, but I'm going to have you explain what astroturf means.
Okay, well, it's a play on grassroots. Okay,
Mhm.
so just as astroturf is fake grass,
Mhm.
an astroturf campaign is a fake grassroots campaign. It's a campaign that is made to appear as though it's coming, from below the grassroots, but is really being orchestrated by either corporations or ideological groups. Right? So
So
that's
why
what.
would they do that? Why would they do that for something like hydroxychloroquine?
Well, that is kind of interesting because first, for one thing, you've probably seen that website, the hydroxychloroquine trial site,
The COVID-19
or
something?
COVID-19 data, or
Yeah,
COVID-19
yeah, yeah, yeah.
trials. That has every whiff of astroturf to it, and it's amazing how fast it pivoted to ivermectin. When the evidence for hydroxychloroquine didn't pan out. But in any event, why would they do it? Well, depends. I mean, politically, again, if you have a miracle cure, then you don't need a vaccine, you don't need masks, you don't need social distancing, you don't need lockdowns, right?
Just take a drug and you're good.
Take a drug for prevention, take a drug if you get a little sick, and it's fine. So if you have a highly effective treatment, then you don't need all these public health interventions, which is of course not true, because even if we did have highly effective treatments, you would still want to try to limit the spread, but that message is, so either for reasons of ideology or reasons of profit, depending upon, and often, big corporations and business interests are aligned with these ideological actors. I like to point to the American
Frontline physicians.
Well, there's them.
Oh, American Academy of
I'm talking about the Great Barrington Declaration.
Ah.
And it was at the American Institute for Economic Research, I believe, AIER.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Which is a right-wing think tank, which was behind the Great Barrington Declaration. They found 3 scientists whom, I don't care if I offend them if they ever see this, which they won't, but I basically called them useful idiots because they clearly have an ideological sympathy for the sorts of things that AIER does, like economic freedom, no government lockdowns, etc. And they signed on to this declaration, which basically advocated what they called focused protection, the idea being, well, young people don't really have to worry about COVID very much. If you really only have to worry about it if you're like over 60 or something like that, or if you have like the number of comorbid conditions, like diabetes or etc. So we just protect them. They just isolate, and everybody else goes about their business. They seem to forget that, and they're very vague about how to accomplish this. Intentionally so, I think, but they ignore the very obvious problem that if the virus is circulating widely in everybody else, in the population, the younger population, the supposedly young, healthy population, that you can't protect the elderly. You can't protect those because somebody's got to help take care of them. And and that's the people who are out and about where the virus is circulating widely.
Right, and we've seen this play out in some of our most vulnerable communities to, tremendous amounts of life.
But, it was very much, and I really do think the Great Barrington Declaration was very much an AstroTurf, effort. And hopefully we'll get the chance to lay out the evidence for that soon. But
no.
I can't really, I haven't really written about it on the blog so much other than to, obliquely, but yeah.
Right. I mean, it reminds me of lead and gasoline, smoking.
Oh no, it's very much like that.
Yeah.
Just for people kind of tobacco, the tobacco companies, the fossil fuel companies, etc. And there's another bit to the ideology. So here's another thing that surprised a lot of people at the beginning of the pandemic, was how fast anti-vaxxers made common cause with the anti-lockdown, anti-mask, COVID deniers. There were people who, a lot of people were very surprised by that. Even I was a little bit surprised at how fast it happened.
They have a tremendous amount of overlap.
Well, here's the overlap. And I wrote about this not too a while back. What the two groups share in common is basically an overriding hostility to public health. In other words, anything that requires that individuals do something, not necessarily just for themselves, but for public health, they don't like, because they view it as, government, is tyranny, if you want to put it that way.
Right, well, it's my body, my choice.
Well, there's that, and they purposely co-opted that from the pro-choice movement, the "my body, my choice." It was like, it wasn't even subtle. It was like it's exactly the same words.
Right. So it's autonomy. They share that desire for autonomy in the most simplistic way.
Well, yes, but they share. They value for basically autonomy and their rights above like all else. Mm-hmm. So like they basically don't even care. They don't care if they're disease vectors. You can't force them to. and that's like and that's an old one. Go back to anti-vaxxers before the pandemic. There was a frequent argument that, well, if the vaccines work so
Right.
well, why are you afraid of my unvaccinated child?
Right. I can't give you cookies if I don't have cookies.
And my point, the obvious answer is no vaccine is 100% effective, and some are considerably less than that.
Right. That's a perfect segue, because another thing I want to talk about is they are claiming that the vaccines don't stop transmission. And because of that, if someone's vaccinated, they're more likely to spread COVID. And so you should stay away from them.
Yeah, I mean, there's two aspects to that. I mean, first of all, it's not true. I think the evidence is coming in more and more that these vaccines are very effective at stopping transmission. That's becoming more and more clear as time goes on. It wasn't necessarily obvious when the vaccines were first, starting to be deployed.
Right, but it was probably written in the study in which they will point to saying it doesn't prevent transmission. I've heard that said, but it
yeah,
says.
The original clinical trials were not designed to test that because they were designed just to test whether the vaccines prevented disease,
Severe disease, right.
severe disease especially.
We were going for that, and we got so much more.
But in any event, where was I? So
It does.
There's also an old anti-vaccine trope about live attenuated virus vaccines.
Shedding.
Where you shed the recently vaccinated shed virus. And it was a concern. That's a perfect example of an anti-vaccine talking point that has a germ of truth to it. But if you'll excuse the term,
a speck.
But and in fact, for a while, out of an overabundance of caution, a lot of cancer wards, for pediatric cancer, did recommend that they not have a child who's immunosuppressed be around children who've been recently vaccinated with, for instance, MMR or chickenpox or the ones that are live attenuated virus vaccines. It turns out that they've all changed those guidelines. They don't say that anymore, and it turns out that the number of cases of actual disease from shedding is like vanishingly small. It's like incredibly rare. So yes. Can it happen? Yes. Does it happen? Almost never. But the interesting thing about the COVID vaccines, of course, is that they do not have whole vaccine of any sort, either killed or live attenuated. They are
any virus, right?
They just induce the host cells to make spike protein, which then provokes an immune response. So there is no way for the vaccine to produce whole virus. It just can't happen. They're not designed to do that. It's basically impossible. Did that stop
No.
anti-vaxxers from repurposing shedding for COVID-19? No, of course not. So basically they had to, the idea came about that, while the spike protein alone is horribly toxic, and it doesn't help that I shouldn't say it doesn't help. There have been papers that show that the spike protein alone, without the virus, can cause issues. Can injure certain cells and organs. Okay, fair enough.
Oh, I want to stop you for just a minute because I don't want to even leave a germ of fear in what you just said, and that.
Well, I was going to get into explaining why it's not.
You're going to go? I should let you go. Okay, I'll let you go.
well, I mean, basically, there was a study just last week, that shows that the amount of spike protein produced that gets out of the cells in people who are vaccinated is picograms per mil. It's like at the border, at the very limits of detection, of the assay, and that the amount used in those experiments that show the spike protein alone can cause all those problems was many orders of magnitude more. Like we're talking like 40 or 50,000 fold higher concentrations.
Right, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is the way the vaccine works is you make a small amount of spike protein triggers the immune response, and it's gone. It's not like your whole body turns into a spike protein factory.
Right. I mean, basically, first off, spike protein does not have a signal sequence for secretion, so it can't be secreted. It stays in the cells, and it lodges in the membrane. You know, and that's how, and because it's, and what happens then, the immune system detects it, and it destroys the cells, you know, that harbor the spike protein
in your arm,
which are going to be muscle cells,
right? In your arm,
because that's where the injection is, and a very tiny amount can get into the bloodstream. You know, like I said, that study showed it, you know, on the order of at most 50 picograms per mil.
How small is a picogram for people who don't know?
10 to the minus 12 grams, which, I mean, I don't know how, you know.
How did they measure it?
They measured it with a very sensitive immunoassay. That's how they measured it in that study. It was a very, so, well, but here's the thing. So the anti-vaccine claim is that, oh, they told us that it doesn't get into the blood at all, that, you know, but they lied. They can detect it in the blood. Well, they didn't check with an assay this sensitive. You know, it's like, so they weren't lying. They just, this assay, there wasn't a sensitive enough assay at the time.
Right, but that would not be what we call clinically relevant.
No, exactly. It's, and if it's so tiny an amount, and it's transient too. It doesn't go for it doesn't show up for very long. You know, because they took blood samples every day for like like 3 weeks or something. The other thing I like to say about this, for instance, for the RNA vaccines anyway. So, you know, the anti-vaxxers like to make it sound like it will cause you to become a permanent spike protein factory. You know, when you get injected.
Reverse transcriptase. I've heard that myth.
But here's the thing. If that were the case, then why do you need a second dose? 3 to 4 weeks later.
Right. It's not logical. But we know it doesn't do that. We already know it doesn't do that, and it doesn't affect the fertility at all.
And then if you look at it in another way, you know, the amount that is actually getting into the bloodstream is so tiny that to claim that the amount that whatever amount could potentially be secreted, you know, shed would be, you know, even more ridiculously small, and to claim that could somehow affect other people around you is just, you know, we're getting into miasmas and homeopathy here practically.
Right. You know what? I don't want to keep you. I know you're really busy, and I already told you that I had over long list.
Oh, okay, that's fine. So what do you want?
We could talk about this all day, and I really appreciate it. I just want to give the information for your blog so people can check it out, and a couple more resources, because like I said at the beginning, I think there's a lot of people who are really confused.
Well, I always recommend Vincent Iannelli's blog.
Yes, Vaxopedia.
Vaxopedia, yeah.
I don't know how he does it.
In fact, I link to it often, so.
Yeah, no, it's really good, especially if you don't want a rabbit hole. You know, if you don't.
That's what I mean. I go down the rabbit hole. He does it much shorter, and you know.
Right. But some people want that. You know, I want to thank you personally. I didn't go into it in this talk, but I have a daughter on the autism spectrum, and you saved me many years ago, just so you know. I don't get into that right now.
Okay.
But I'm a big fan for that reason, and I like rabbit holes too. So there's yours, Respectful Insolence. There's your not so secret other blog, Science-Based Medicine.
Right. And, you know, Gorski on Twitter, you know.
Yeah, Twitter. And there's Skeptical Raptor.
I'm not part of that.
You're not part of it, but I'm giving it as a resource.
No, but it's a good resource, and Dorrit Rice also writes on there.
Right, Dorrit, who I interviewed. Yeah, she's fabulous. So are you, and thank you so much for doing this with me.
No problem.
Thanks.
Happy to do it.
You too. Thanks.
All right, thanks.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye.